So welcome everyone. This is our Forever Chemicals webinar, the first in our Clean Water Champions series. We are very grateful to Environment and Climate Change Canada for funding this series of webinars that we are delivering. They were planned to be in person at NADA in Vancouver, but this is actually really exciting. Now that they're online, we have people joining us from all over the country. So very excited to have you all here and welcome. I'd like to acknowledge where the event is being broadcast. I am in Vancouver. I'm on the unceded ancestral traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, which includes the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish nations. If you'd like to share with us where you're joining us from, I encourage you to go type that in the chat. You can let us know your background too. If you have any if you're working in this area, if you have a personal interest in learning about toxic chemicals, or maybe how you heard about it from C-Smart. So just a little introduction of yourselves in the chat if you'd like to over there. And just to let you know a little bit about how the webinar will be, it's more interactive. So please ask as many questions as you like in the chat. If anyone asks a question and you know the answer to it, or you have a resource you want to share, pop that into the chat. We'll share all of the links in our follow-up email to all registrants too. So please be as sharing and as communicative as you'd like in that chat. This webinar is being hosted by C-Smart. And we are a charity. We're based in Vancouver, and our mission is to inspire and empower people to love and protect our oceans. And you can see from this picture here, we do a lot of youth programs. So we have summer camps, online programs, including courses that we've created. We go out to schools to deliver workshops, and we have after school programs that we deliver at schools, but also with vulnerable youth. Since COVID started, we have been doing a lot of online teaching. So we've rebranded our school workshops as Virtual C-School. And so we connect directly with teachers in their classrooms. And that's part of our Clean Water Champions. We also have a workshop series that we've been teaching all about freshwater pollution and getting kids to actually take action in their communities to address freshwater pollution issues relevant to their areas. We also have a series of online self-led courses called Ocean Defender, and we're creating a Clean Water Champions online course. So just taking all this information, we want to spread it as far and wide as we can, and making that resource available to teachers so they can have this content and teach it themselves too. But we also do programs for adults. We have our webinars like you're part of right now, and to raise some funds for C-Smart too, and our youth programs, that a lot of which is subsidized. We run corporate programs. So we go out to the beach, bring people out there, teach them about plastic pollution and waste. We do lunch and learns. So is that something that you think your company might be interested in, or you know of any groups, please let them know about the programs that we offer. Right now, this is more Vancouver based, but it's relevant for people across Canada, depending on if you live close to a beach or some waterways. We have our Explore the Shore Challenge, which is going on for the whole summer, from now until the end of September. And it's a downloadable pack. You get these badges, you get a list of challenges, some riddles, and it's all about spending time outside in your local community and discovering new places around where you live. Our next Clean Water Champions webinar is called All About Plastics. And a lot of us are fairly saturated on messages about plastic. So we're really going to go into depth about bioplastics, microplastics, and the circular economy. So if you're interested in that, please mark this date on your calendars, May 27th. All right, so we are here to learn about forever chemicals. And we have our first guest speaker is going to be Angeline Tillmans. And Angeline is the Senior Water Quality Guideline Scientist for the BC Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. And she's also an adjunct professor with the School of Environmental Studies at the University of Victoria. Angeline is going to be introducing us to the diversity and the complexity of toxic chemicals and how it's not quite so easy to monitor and measure them. So please please join me in welcoming Angeline.
Great. Thank you so much, Paloma. I will share my screen if I can. So hopefully you can all see that. Well, thank you everyone so much for taking the time out of your busy day to come to this and to listen to this presentation. So I will be talking about forever chemicals, but to start with, I just wanted to take a kind of a big picture perspective because we've all heard about the Anthropocene, this idea that there's vast global changes going on in the world from climate change, habitat loss, biodiversity loss. But what we don't think of very much is what's happening at the micro scale with all these synthetic chemicals going into the environment and the impact that those are having, which are probably just as large as an effect. So Rachel Carson first brought this to all of our attention in 1996 with her book, The Silent Spring. And in this, she wrote, "The most alarming of all of man's assaults upon the environment is the contamination of air, earth, water, and sea with dangerous and even lethal materials." So that was in 1962. But since then, we've learned a great deal. We've learned a lot about molecular and cellular physiology, especially in the last 20 years. And we really have a better understanding now of what happens inside the cell, how we move from the DNA in the nucleus, how it's transcribed and split together, packaged up into mRNA that's transported out of the nucleus and is made into proteins. And there's so many specific steps that have to happen in a very certain way. And so when we have these xenobiotics, these synthetic chemicals in the environment, what they can do is they can interrupt this molecular interactions. So this is called adverse outcome pathways, where we start all the way from a toxicant and we link it to the molecular interactions, the cellular response, what happens in the organs, and then the organ system, and then all the way to the organism, and finally the population. And there's these series of biological events that happen at every step, and we don't have them figured out for all the chemicals, but we're learning more and more with different genomics tools that these synthetic chemicals are having an effect at the molecular level, and they're disrupting cellular responses. So that can lead to effects in reproduction or immune systems or the endocrine systems. And so we're gaining more information. And at the same time as biologists are beginning to understand this, the amount of synthetic chemicals being released and produced is increasing. So we have increasing diversity of synthetic chemicals. So for example, there's a chemical abstract services registry where everybody registers the new chemicals they've created. And the number of chemicals created has risen from 20 million to 156 million between 2002 and 2019. So the diversity of chemicals that we're creating are increasing. At the same time, between 75,000 and 140,000 synthetic chemicals are in production. So these are produced industrial for mass use. And in Canada, we have about 23,000 chemicals are in use in amounts greater than 1 ton. So we have a lot of chemicals not only being created, but produced and used across Canada and around the world. So how do these chemicals reach our environment? So we have many different chemical pathways. In the Salish Sea, for a lot of chemicals, for example, PCBs, one of the main inputs is actually atmospheric transport. So a lot of these chemicals can actually volatilize, get into the atmosphere, and start circulating the globe. So we have atmospheric transport of some chemicals, we have industrial sites, but then a lot of them come in, the pesticides and the pharmaceuticals can come in from agriculture, from urban gray water, from septic systems. And then also we have the runoff from the cities, and they all kind of wash into the ecosystem, where we might have effects with reproduction, with food web, disrupting the food webs, interacting with things like climate change and habitat loss to put even more stress on the organism, and moving across through the food web, so causing, through generations, so causing effects across generations, either in the development of the organism or in the ability of the organism to pass on that genetic information to the next generation. And so the chemicals we're seeing in the environment are two types. There's persistent chemicals, which we've nicknamed forever chemicals. And those are the chemicals like plastic, they just don't break down. The bonds between the molecules or between the atoms are such that the bacteria, they just don't break them apart very well. And they can last for hundreds of years. And then we have pseudo persistent chemicals. And those are the ones that continuously wash into the environment. So they're coming in, it's like caffeine is a good example. Everybody's drinking caffeine all the time, and it's just going out through our sewage waste systems, and then it's constantly in the environment. So these are called pseudo persistent. So we have both kinds going on. But once we have all these chemicals into the environment, how do we know what's really there? Well, you have to go out and you have to measure it. So somebody's got to go out and take a water sample, or maybe take a sediment sample of the, at the bottom of the sea or at the bottom of a river or lake, or take a tissue sample, for example, from fish. And that's because not all chemicals are in the water. Sometimes they are more sticky to sediment, or they're more sticky to fish because they're lipophilic. They like to be in the fat. They don't like to be in the water. So you take these water samples and then you send it to a lab. And then the lab will use different techniques, different machinery to identify the chemicals. But as you can imagine, there's so many different chemicals that are going to be in the water. And so we have, the persistent organic chemicals, pesticides, pharmaceuticals and personal care products, disinfection byproducts. And so when those samples come to the lab, typically what happens is people are only looking for specific chemicals. And those are the chemicals that have been identified. We have certain laboratory techniques for them, and they're easy to identify. But it's very hard to go through a sample and say, well, just what's here? Like, what are all the different chemicals? And so I'm going to tell you a bit of an example of somebody that did this and the difficulties that they found. So for example, there's some great work that came out of the state of Washington, the University of Washington, where researchers for the last 20 years have noticed that, there's a lot of salmon dying in the streams. So there's been urban restoration. The streams are in much better conditions. There's good oxygen, there's good sediment, like gravel in the streams, but the salmon are coming in and they seem to be dying. And then the researchers noticed that this was happening right after rain events. So they hypothesized maybe there's something in the water that's being washed off of the land. But it took them years to try to identify what it was. And finally, they figured out that it's actually coming out of tires. It's a 6,6-PD or 6-PD quinone is added to tires as an antioxidant to stop the tires from degrading when they're exposed to ground level oxygen or ground level ozone. But when the tires skid across the pavement, microparticles of those tires come off, and then the chemical 6,6-PPD quinone washes off into the stream. So right after a rain event, you get a lot of these chemicals washing off. But it took a researcher 2 years in the laboratory to figure this out. And I just want to try to explain a bit of the complexity. So this is a figure from the Science article where they published their results. And to try to explain it, so on the left-hand side, you'll see that gray bar, and at the top is the number 2,216. So what they did is they took the tires, they took both new tires and old tires, they ground them up, they mixed it with water, and they took out that leachate, and they identified 2,216 organic chemicals in there. And then what they did is they said, okay, well, some of these go in water, some of these we can extract in alcohol. So they extracted them in ethanol, and that's the red arrow. I can use my cursor here. So that's the red arrow here from the ethanol. And then they measured that extract and they found, oh, it's toxic in fish. Okay. So what did they do now? Then they used another chemical and they extracted it again. They found in the silica gel, they were able to identify something that was toxic to fish. Now they're down to 659 chemicals. So then they put it through an HPLC column, so a high pressure liquid chromatography column, which is it's like this big and it's like this round and it's packed with these microscopic beads. And so you put this slew of organic chemicals, you push it through a very high pressure. And what it does is the chemicals spread out because of the different charges of the different molecules. And so they said, okay, we put that through, and at 10 to 11 minutes, they got another fraction. And this time it had 225 chemicals. And they did this 2 more times and 3 more times until finally they got a fraction of a pure chemical that was killing the fish. And they said at this point, well, this is great, we found it. But they didn't actually know what it was. They had a molecular structure. They knew it had so many carbons, so many oxygens, so many hydrogens, but they didn't know where it was coming from. And it was sounded to me from what I heard, it was kind of by luck that somebody was reading a report from industry from 1986, and they found this chemical mentioned in the tires that was put into the tires to protect them, and it had the same molecular structure. So they synthesized this chemical and they tested it, and that's how they figured out that yes, this was the chemical that was killing the fish. But you can see trying to identify the chemicals in the environment, it's a major task because there's so many, they're so diverse, and the analytical techniques that, like the chemistry techniques that you need to separate the chemicals and find the ones that are causing the problem, it takes a long time and a lot of effort. And so one of the authors from this study, he wrote that most people think that we know what chemicals are toxic, and all we have to do is control the amount of those chemicals to make sure water quality is fine. But in fact, animals are exposed to this giant chemical soup, and we don't know what many of the chemicals in it even are. So we're in this situation where we have this huge diversity of chemicals. They're coming into the environment from all those different sources, from from agriculture, pharmaceuticals, personal care products, industry. And then once they're in the environment, it's very hard to understand which chemicals are showing up, the effects that they're having, and the interactions that they're having. So I would advocate that we need a paradigm shift. So we need to move away from this idea that dilution is okay, that if we just have a little bit of chemical and we put it in the great big sea, that's okay. I think we're at this point where we realize we need a different way of managing chemicals. And the neat thing is that not only managing chemicals, but also creating chemicals. So scientists and chemists, they're aware of this, and they're starting to talk about green chemistry. I'm just gonna take a quick sip of tea, sorry. So this idea in green chemistry, before when a chemical engineer would develop a new chemical, the most important thing that it did what they wanted the chemical to do. So functionality was the most important thing. But now what they're talking about is this not just functionality, they also have to minimize harm. And this is a great shift. So before the chemical sector, they would take renewable resources, fossil fuels, and they'd put it all together, they'd produce the chemical, they'd use it, and then once that chemical end of life, if it was in a product or if it was being emitted, it would just go into the landfill, it would be incinerated, or it would end up in the environment. And so this linear process. But now we're moving to this circular economy, which you hear about with the plastics and other things. But with the chemicals, what's neat is that waste arrow at the end of life, the idea is that you're reclaiming a lot of those chemicals, especially if they're persistent, and we have to use that so that they go back into the production. And then that arrow at the end of life, so I can point to it right here, anything that comes off here, this has got to be biodegradable so that it's not persisting in the environment. So with that, I'll leave it to the other speakers. So thank you for listening.
Oh, wonderful, Angeline. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. That was just so incredibly informative. I didn't know about the pseudo persistent chemicals like coffee. I think that's a really interesting one for us to think about, not the fact that it persists in the environment, but the fact that we're constantly releasing a flow of it in there. And then how long it took them to figure out that 6-PPD quinone was the culprit for all the salmon dying. I think that's a great example to show of, how there aren't these studies that get done beforehand before we start using a chemical in our products. It's very much post seeing an impact and then trying to address it, and then by then there's been a lot of harm done. And the fact that there's also a circular economy, we think of that a lot, as you say, for plastics, but the fact that we're also um, that's also relevant for these chemicals, and that there's a push for that green chemistry. That's something I'm going to start advocating too. So thank you for teaching us about that. All right, so that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Angeline. And next up, we have two speakers joining us from the Chemical Management Division of Environment and Climate Change Canada. We have Shinjini Pilon, who is a program scientist. She's working on reducing the threat of contaminants to southern resident killer whales as part of the Whales Initiative Contaminants team. She has a PhD in chemical and environmental toxicology and has researched pollutants in remote First Nations communities. We're also being joined by Lorrie Hayes, who leads the risk management of persistent organic pollutants and asbestos, which is one of the national focal points for Canada in the Stockholm Convention. Lorrie has a master's in chemical engineering and over 20 years of experience working on the development and implementation and regulations of toxic chemicals. So the development and implementation of the regulations, not the development of the toxic chemicals, apologies. So Shinjini and Lorrie are going to be sharing insights on the impacts of toxic chemicals on southern resident killer whales, and also with a bit of a focus on PFAS. So please join me in welcoming Lorrie and Shinjini.
Thank you, Paloma. I'm just going to pull up my screen here. There we go. And I'll just be putting it in presentation mode. Can you let me know when, Paloma, can you let me know if I'm sharing it properly?
Yeah, that looks great.
Thank you. Perfect. Thanks. So thank you, and I'm so happy to be here to talk a little bit about contaminants and how they are impacting southern resident killer whales today. So I'll be talking specifically about southern resident killer whales. Our team focuses on reducing the impact of contaminants on endangered whales in general in Canadian waters. So I'll talk a little bit about the southern resident killer whales. This is a population of whales that has been listed as endangered under the Species at Risk Act for quite some time now. And their current population size is 74. They are icons of the Salish Sea, of the area where they are found, especially for citizens in BC, coastal communities, Indigenous groups. There are really strong cultural and spiritual ties to this population of animals. Their diet is comprised mostly of Chinook salmon, and one of the reasons that's important is from the standpoint of making sure that they have enough prey available to them, and they're able to access their prey, as the lack of prey or prey availability has also been identified as a significant threat to this population. So Angeline already gave a really good overview of how contaminants make their way into our waterways and how they come into the ocean, and she also touched on how they enter the food web as well. So the contaminants that are entering the food web are the contaminants that we're really concerned with when it comes to animals such as southern resident killer whales. As Angeline mentioned, many contaminants have properties that allow them to accumulate within an organism. So they accumulate within the tissue of an organism rather than being excreted out of the animal. So what happens is that over time, the contaminant burden for that animal increases. The concentration of contaminants increase within their tissue, especially within their fatty tissues. So this is a particular concern for an animal such as the killer whale, which is a top predator of its food chain as it consumes Chinook salmon. And so what happens is through a process known as biomagnification, the concentrations of these contaminants are actually higher for animals that feed higher on the food chain, including the killer whale. So I've tried to depict that very simple in a very simple manner on the slide there with the red circles. So again, higher concentrations of these contaminants higher up in the food chain. Again, the killer whale being a top predator, very high in its food chain. So that's the concern there. So in terms of where these contaminants are coming from, there are a number of different sources that we are learning more about. But as Angeline mentioned, there are so many chemicals that are released from so many different types of sources. It makes it a very complicated problem. So some of the sources that we have been able to characterize and we're trying to assess include effluent from wastewater treatment plants, industrial effluent from pulp and paper mills, from mining processes, runoff from roadways, agricultural practices, and then the list goes on. These are just a few. There are other sources as well. All to say is that this brings so many different contaminants, many of which, as Angeline mentioned, persist in the environment, or we're calling them forever chemicals, so they last a really long time in the environment. So in 2018, the federal government launched the Whales Initiative. And this was in support of the recovery of 3 endangered whale species, one of them being the southern resident killer whale specifically. Later that year, an imminent threat assessment was conducted specifically on the southern resident killer whales. And the reason I bring this up was this assessment essentially concluded that these whales are facing imminent threats to their survival and their recovery. And one of the components that came out of this additional funding and out of this specific assessment was the development, the formation of technical working groups to address the main threats that these whales are facing. So I won't talk about the other threats right now, but I wanted to mention the Contaminants Technical Working Group, as this is the technical working group that is chaired by our group at Environment and Climate Change Canada. So this technical working group is comprised of all levels of government, non-governmental organizations, and academics as well. So all providing expert advice to mitigate this threat of contaminants on these whales. So one of the key objectives of this Contaminants Technical Working Group was identifying contaminants of concern that would be particularly of concern to southern resident killer whales, as well as Chinook salmon. So to link back to what Angeline was mentioning before, animals are exposed to essentially a chemical soup in the waters. And so to figure out which contaminants we really need to be focusing our attention on when it comes to recovery of a particular species is really complicated. So we did a lot of literature review and we put a lot of expert advice into developing a list of these contaminants. So I won't go into details about the chemicals that are listed in this table, but I did want to point out that most of the chemicals that we're concerned with southern resident killer whales especially, is that are chemicals that are known to bioaccumulate. So chemicals that end up lingering or accumulating within the tissue of the animal. I highlighted here in purple a couple contaminants that are perfluoroalkylated substances. And this is just highlighted as a couple other speakers today will be touching on these substances. So I just wanted to note that they are on our list of contaminants, and they are actually of major concern to both the whales and the Chinook salmon. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other work that we have in progress. A lot of this is being done in collaboration with our technical working group. Under the Whales Initiative, we've been able to increase our monitoring capacity of freshwater, air, sediments, landfill leachate. We are also monitoring effluent from wastewater, all to get a better idea of the contaminant concentrations that are entering whale habitat and what the whales and their prey are exposed to. So that's part of it. We are also working in collaboration with our scientist colleagues at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, who are looking at the contaminant concentrations specifically in the fish tissue as well as whale blubber, and looking at the health effects of these contaminants on the Chinook salmon and on the whales themselves. So kind of putting all of it together, we're trying to get a better understanding of the contaminants that are entering whale habitat and the kinds of health effects that they're having on the salmon and the whales themselves. We are also in the final stages of putting together a mapping contaminant inventory tool, which is essentially a way for us to visualize contaminants that are being released from different sources, including wastewater treatment plants, industrial processes, runoff from agriculture, for example. And this allows us to visualize and estimate the contaminant concentrations coming from the different sources through a map. And what will this lead to is being able to identify where contaminant hotspots are and which contaminants are coming from which sources. So we're really excited about this tool. As I mentioned, we're in the final stages of developing it and hope to be launching it for public use very soon. Finally, we're also working on recommending environmental quality guidelines that are specifically protective of southern resident killer whales and their prey. So classically, many guidelines that are developed for water, sediment, and tissue do not take into account animals that feed higher up in the food chain. Many of these guidelines are developed with invertebrates and smaller aquatic organisms in mind. So we're trying to shift that thinking. And coincidentally, actually, Angeline, who we just heard from, is kind of leading sort of a subgroup within our contaminant technical working group to advance this work and develop a protocol specifically for substances that bioaccumulate. So again, we're really excited about this work and where it ends up going and where it takes us. So I'll leave it there. I just wanted to mention that we do have a web page that we launched a few months ago that talks a little bit more about some of the actions that we're taking through the federal government to mitigate this threat. So if you're interested, I'll post a link in our chat. You can also from here download a list of recommendations that were put forward last year by our Contaminants Technical Working Group. Many of these recommendations have actions that we are now pursuing. So if you're interested, you can find out more there. Also available for download is our spreadsheet of currently recommended environmental quality guidelines for the southern resident killer whales as well as the Chinook salmon. So that's also available if you're interested. And with that, I will pass it off to Lorrie. Lorrie, if you would like, I can keep sharing my screen or you can take over. It's up to you.
If you don't mind, that would be great. I'll avoid the awkwardness of switching over. So yeah, I wanted to start by thanking everyone for taking time out of your evening to join us tonight. I'm really excited to be here to give you a bit of information about how Environment Climate Change Canada has been managing the risk associated with PFAS, which are one of the, if you Google forever chemicals, you'd probably come across PFAS. And so I'm going to talk about what we've done to manage PFAS and where we're headed in the future. So if you wouldn't mind, next slide. So my slides aren't as pretty. I'll have to apologize as the previous ones, but hopefully useful. I just want to explain that these are 4,700 human-made substances. So it's a big group of compounds. They have carbon and fluorine atoms in them. And basically, these substances have been used in a very broad range of products because of the unique properties that they possess. Products that contain PFAS that you might find in your home include things like carpets, clothing, cosmetics, etc. And one that you'll often hear discussed is aqueous firefighting foams that are used to fight fuel fires. PFAS are not manufactured in Canada, so they enter the Canadian market by being imported into Canada, either as the substance itself or within the products. So next slide, please. So some PFAS have been studied by the scientific community in a lot greater detail than others. Some of them I think that were mentioned earlier, like PFAS and PFOA. And so the ones that have been studied a lot have demonstrated the characteristics that are outlined on this slide, and I think that have been talked about earlier. So they are extremely persistent. And this is where the notion of being a forever chemical really comes from, meaning that they don't easily break down under normal conditions in the environment and within organisms. And because they don't break down, as explained earlier, additional releases can cause levels to keep building up. So even though PFAS are human-made, meaning they don't occur naturally, still certain PFAS have been detected in wildlife and humans all around the globe. They've been found in drinking water, in ice cores from the Arctic, soils, sediments, the oceans, the atmosphere, indoor air and dust, like really everywhere that we've looked, I think. And their presence in remote locations like the Canadian Arctic, it tells us that they're subject to something called long-range transport, meaning that they move really long distances in the environment through the atmosphere and ocean currents to places far from where they were released. As mentioned, these are bioaccumulative substances, meaning that the concentrations are higher in top predators. And this means that the wildlife that are higher in the food web, like polar bears, like the whales that we talked about earlier, seals and birds, they might be more likely to suffer adverse effects. So in Canada, PFAS releases, they can happen during the use or training of products like firefighting foams, or during consumer use of products, after disposal. And so landfills and wastewater treatment facilities are also sources. Next slide, please. So what has the government of Canada been doing about PFAS? Well, we evaluated the risks of 3 subgroups of PFAS, PFOS, PFOA, and long-chain PFCAs, and published the findings of those screening assessment reports back in 2006 and 2012. Those substances were found to be toxic to the environment, and they were added to what's called the list of toxic substances that's under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And as a result, we put measures in place to manage the risks from those 3 groups of PFAS. Next slide, please. So under what are called the Prohibition of Certain Toxic Substances regulations, the manufacture, the use, the sale, and import of those 3 PFAS that I talked about, that's been prohibited, as well as the products that contain them. But there are a limited number of exemptions. And in 2018, we published a guidance document that outlined our proposal to further restrict these substances and to remove all of those exemptions. And those proposed regulations are targeted in the fall of 2021. Also on PFAS, we're conducting regular monitoring and surveillance of certain PFAS in the environment, not all 4,700. And also for the past decade, concentrations of some PFAS have been measured in the blood of Canadians, for example, by Health Canada. The federal government also develops guidelines to protect human health and the environment. For example, we have drinking water quality guidelines for PFAS and PFOA, and we have federal environmental quality guidelines for PFAS in a bunch of media. I also should mention that there's work happening internationally at the global and regional level on PFAS. So for example, PFAS and PFOA are listed to the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. And another PFAS called PFHFS has also been nominated. And in addition, PFAS, PFOA, and long-chain PFCAs are chemicals of mutual concern under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, meaning that Canada and the US are working together on those. And Canada recently, just a little while ago on April 26th, published a draft Canadian Great Lakes strategy for these substances. And that's open for a 30-day comment period. So if you're interested in that, I really recommend having a look and sending your comments. I know those working on it would really appreciate that. Next slide, please. So on April 24th, just this past couple weeks ago now, was it 2 weeks, COVID time, the Government of Canada, we published a notice of intent to address PFAS as a class. So this is exciting. While PFAS and PFOA and long-chain PFCAs are subject to regulations in Canada, those regulations don't address the majority of the other PFAS that are commercially available. So we are intending to move forward with activities to address the broad class of PFAS because there's scientific evidence that indicates that the PFAS that have been used to replace those regulated PFAS, they may also be associated with environmental or human health effects. So because there's a large number of PFAS that are available and they have diverse chemical structures, and there's a lack of data on each individual substance, that makes it really impractical for us to follow the sort of traditional substance by substance assessment and management approach that we typically take at Environment Canada, and that was taken for PFAS, PFOA, and long-chain PFCAs. So basically, this notice of intent signaled that in 2021, we're going to invest and we continue to invest in research and monitoring. We're collecting information on PFAS to inform taking a class-based approach. And we're looking at what's happening in other jurisdictions because there is a lot of action happening in other jurisdictions as well. In addition, within the next 2 years, we've committed to publish a State of Pfas report summarizing relevant information, and that would be the first step towards eventually taking action if risks are identified. So stakeholder engagement is a super important part of our process, and so we invite the public and all interested stakeholders to provide input to help us inform our activities. And right now there's you're welcome to submit comments or questions. If you go to the next slide, I think there's an email address there and a website. Yeah, so thank you again for letting me speak. I tried to cover a lot quickly, so apologize if it was a lot, but happy to answer any questions. And if in a couple of weeks you think of something else that you want to ask that you didn't have a chance to ask tonight, there is an email address there, and my team would be very happy to respond to any questions you might have. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Lorrie, for sharing, and Shinjini too. Sorry, I will. Yeah, it's really great to hear about the work that's being done by Government of Canada. Wonderful news, the notice of intent to address it. It's a huge step, and so it's great to hear that we're going to be taking action on this. I put in the chat if anyone is interested. There is going to be a webinar next week by our friends from Georgia Strait Alliance. Shinjini is going to be talking again about killer whales and contaminants. It's a whole webinar on that topic with focus on southern resident killer whales, which are the species, endangered species in the Salish Sea. There were a few questions in the chat about DDT. Yes, it has been banned in Canada. However, it is a persistent chemical, so it is still in our environment. And that was something that was used in, oops, I can stop it. Part that I wanted to do. Sorry. Well, it's good that you can stop. I'm piling up liquid. I'm just looking for anyone who's not muted. Everyone seems muted. I don't know where that's coming from. All right, so next up we have a breakout room session that we are going to all participate in. So there'll be about 6 people in a breakout room. So maybe if someone's not as active, there'll still be people to have chats with. These are the questions that we propose as discussion items for you all. But I welcome you to introduce yourselves, share a little bit about your background, again, that your interest in joining this webinar today. And if you'd like, you can chat about what are some things that you have in your home that you think might be contributing to water contamination. So that first step of acknowledging where are some of these items that we know that we are contributing to, and how might we reduce our exposure to PFAS and other toxic chemicals in our home. And on a bigger level, how could we contribute to systemic solutions to this problem? Next up, we have Muhannad Malas, who's joining us. Muhannad was a toxics campaigner at Environmental Defence for over 5 years, where he led effective campaigns to reform Canada's cornerstone pollution prevention law, so the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, CEPA. He worked on eliminating BPA from consumer products and environmental justice policies to protect communities from toxic exposures. Muhannad is going to be sharing insights on toxic chemicals we are exposed to in our everyday lives. So please join me in welcoming Muhannad.
I will just do a quick introduction of myself, because it's because today I'm not here on behalf of any particular organization. I'm here as an environmental campaigner, environmental health, environmental justice campaigner. Previously, I was the toxics campaigner at Environmental Defense Canada, which is an environmental charity that does really cool and awesome stuff here in Canada on toxic chemicals, climate, water issues. And I was there for about 6 years. As Paloma mentioned, I led a number of campaigns to reform the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which is the main legislation that governs toxic chemicals in Canada. And it's also really the foundational environmental protection law in the country that enables the government to regulate plastics, to regulate climate emissions. And I also led campaigns to get companies and push companies to phase out chemicals of concern, including some of the chemicals that we're going to talk about today, like PFAS. And today I am, so I teach a couple of courses. I'm a McMaster, and that's something that I do part-time. But I am now, I have started a new role at another environmental campaigning organization as a senior climate campaigner. And the organization that I'm a part of right now is called Stand.Earth. You may be familiar with it. And Stand.Earth has offices in both Canada and the US, and we really focus on, at least in my role, what I'm focusing on is running campaigns to push the fashion industry to phase out fossil fuels from their supply chains. So it's a really exciting type of work, and it's something that I'm looking forward to dive deeper into, because I've only been in that role for a few weeks. But today I'm going to talk about PFAS chemicals and consumer products, and where you can find them and what you can do about them and how you can take action. So if we can move to the next slide. So in the previous presentation, we heard that PFAS are used in all sort of things. They are used in lots of consumer products, including, I'm going to start with kitchenware and cookware. So this was a recent report by my friends and colleagues at the Ecology Center in the US that really showed that the issue of PFAS in cookware continues to be a big problem. So many of you may know that when you buy a pot or a pan that's non-stick, so specifically if it uses Teflon or something similar to Teflon, that's because in most cases it includes PFAS. And what PFAS does is basically helps to create this coating that makes the pan stick resistant, so it makes it non-stick. And that's a really big problem, because that could lead to exposure in the household. So you could get exposed to PFAS from using those the cookware in your home, but also, as you can see in the slide or the picture to the right, throughout the life cycle of a non-stick pan, there's contamination happening. So from the production of those chemicals, which really leads to a huge amount of water pollution in the US. There's a drinking water crisis where tens of millions of people have their drinking water has high levels of PFAS, but also during the production of the product and then the disposal of the product. In all of those stages, there is exposure, there is contamination, and because these chemicals are so persistent, they really continue to stay in the environment almost, indefinitely. We don't know how long they stay. They just stay for a very long time. So the best way to avoid them is to stick to uncoated pans and pots. So stainless steel, cast iron, ceramic, glass. These are the best, products you can buy. And they last for a long time, and they guarantee that you're not going to get exposed to PFAS. Next slide, please. Another category of products where there is exposure and potential
Muhannad, I lost you. Did other people lose Muhannad too? Okay. We will wait a few seconds.
Okay, did I freeze for a second?
Yes.
Okay.
Start
So
again. Thanks.
I will go over this slide. So another category of products where PFAS can be a problem is clothing and textiles. So whether it's your rain jacket or your waterproof backpack, your hiking shoes, ski wax is another place where PFAS is used. Tents, all of these outdoor, gear and clothing that are supposed to be waterproof. So what makes PFAS so special in terms of their functionality is the fact that is actually the very same thing that makes them so dangerous. The carbon and the fluorine atoms, once they bond, they are indestructible in the environment. That's what makes them so persistent, but also that gives them this feature of making them waterproof and grease-proof, and that's what makes them so useful. But also, really alarmingly, what we found is that products like baby bibs and children products can also contain PFAS, and that's really concerning because babies and young children are very vulnerable to toxic chemicals. Next slide, please. Another area where we can find PFAS is cosmetics and skincare products. And I wanted to share a picture of this guide that I helped develop at Environmental Defense. It's a Toxic 10 skincare guide that helps you identify and avoid 10 toxic chemicals of concern. One of those chemicals or class of chemicals is PFAS. So I know the text is very hard to read, but if you want to check out the Toxic 10 skincare guide, you can just Google Toxic 10 Environmental Defense and it'll take you straight to the website. But basically what you need to do is avoid any ingredient in a product that has the word fluoro in it. So that means it might have a PFAS chemical. And one of the reasons why PFAS is added is because it makes skincare products waterproof. So if a product is marketed as waterproof, you should ask questions about what makes it so. Next slide, please. All right, the next one is food packaging. And this one is a really big one and kind of exciting actually, because there's a lot of movement in the market away from PFAS these days. So this is a report that was published by Toxic Free Future and Mind Restore campaign in the United States, also very close colleagues of mine. And they found that there was, based on testing that they did, lab results showed that there's fluorine in the food packaging in these products that you're seeing to the left of the screen. So the Big Mac box, the the classic French fry bag, and that suggests that there's PFAS in these products. And if you think about it, what makes the paper bag so grease-proof? It's the fact that sometimes it could be treated with PFAS, and that really makes the paper resistant to grease. And to the right, this picture, which I really love because it very clearly shows how this is problematic, because once you throw a food wrapper in the garbage, where does it go? It goes to a landfill, and then it gets processed and it turns into compost that's used in crops and agriculture. There's evidence that farmers have higher levels of PFAS in their body because of that. And it also gets to the environment and it moves around and it gets transported to very far places and very vulnerable ecosystems. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. Next slide, please. So here in Canada, there's mounting evidence showing that Arctic communities in the north are facing high risks from exposure to PFAS. And that's because, as we were talking about, the PFAS that is used here in the south ends up getting transported to northern ecosystems, and then they bioaccumulate, biomagnify, and there's evidence to suggest that Inuit communities, and specifically, there was a study that was published last year showing that pregnant Nunavik women had twice as high the levels of PFAS in their bodies compared to the average Canadian. And that's very problematic because communities in the north are not using these chemicals. They have nothing to do with the contamination. So this makes the issue a real environmental injustice issue. And that's why governments and companies need to take action to protect all of us, but especially the most vulnerable. Next slide, please. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about how to take action. And this is Environmental Defense's petition website or webpage where I was involved for a very long time. So right now, Environmental Defense has 2 campaigns. One to convince Burger King to stop using PFAS chemicals in their packaging. Burger King is owned by Restaurant Brands International, which is Toronto-based. It's a Canadian company, so Canadian consumers can play. And even if you're not a consumer of Burger King, we as people can demand changes, and we can put a lot of pressure on these corporations to make those changes. So I highly recommend that you check out Environmental Defense's campaign on Burger King and support it. And the other one is related to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which is the law that governs toxic chemicals. And just very recently, last month in April, the government introduced a bill to reform the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which is really exciting because it has not been reformed since 1999. And this is really the opportunity where we can make some transformational changes to the market and drive changes to the way we regulate toxic chemicals. But it's exciting to see this bill. However, the bill isn't strong enough. And this is where you can come in. We want to see things like changing the onus of proof to make it the responsibility of industry to prove that chemicals are safe. And if they can't prove that they're safe, that these chemicals are banned. Right now, there is something in this bill along those lines, but it's not strong enough. And groups like Environmental Defense will be working to change that. Another really important element is around substitution of chemicals. One of the things that made the PFAS problem so complicated was the fact that when governments like Canada banned some PFAS chemicals that were really dangerous many years ago, the industry immediately replaced them with thousands of more PFAS chemicals that are similarly harmful. And that basically puts the onus on the government, on us, and on taxpayer money to be able to study these chemicals and regulate them. It needs to be the other way around. And also we need to make sure that when the government bans a chemical, that only a safer substitute takes its place, not another toxic chemical. And this is what Environmental Defense will be working on. So once again, check out the campaign to reform CEPA. CEPA is the acronym for the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and support it if you can. Next slide, please. And the reason why taking action is so key is because it works. When people take action, companies listen, governments listen. And this is just some example of when companies listen to the power and the voices of people. So for example, McDonald's just last year, and I was involved a little bit in this campaign, or not last year actually, this was in January, announced that I will ban or remove toxic PFAS chemicals from food packaging. Imagine the changes that that could lead to. Like every day around the world, I think 2.5 million Big Mac burgers are sold, and all these wrappers get into the environment. So if we can eliminate that source of contamination, that can make a huge difference. Similarly, Wendy's just a few days ago announced a ban on PFAS, and Home Depot, Lowe's, Staples all announced policies to eliminate PFAS from their products, especially carpets and office supplies. So changes can happen if people act and if people demand for them. And I have a lot of hope that those changes will continue because a lot of people are getting more concerned and more angry and want to do something about it to protect their health and their communities. And I really hope that you will continue to be supportive of these sort of groups that are doing these, running these campaigns, because it's so critical. Next slide. I think this is it for me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Muhannad. That was, again, another incredibly informative session there to learn about PFAS and where it's actually found in the everyday items that we're using. There was a question in the chat, but I'll save that for the Q&A at the end. One comment I have is I think people don't realize, even when they think of pollutants as, trash going into the river and ending up in the ocean, but even if it's going to the landfill, it's still an issue over there because of the leaching of those chemicals into the waterway. So it's not like the landfills are a solution. They're also part of the problem there. So just before we get to the Q&A, oops, I'm a little confused as to what I'm sharing now, given the other screen. Just give 1 second, everyone. So Muhannad mentioned some ways to take action, and that's the goal also of this webinar today, is for you to be educated on this, but we really want you to leverage this and actually take action. So think about a product that you have at home that you have the ability to change or eliminate from consuming. Also, you can be talking to those companies, as Muhannad mentioned. That's an effective way of telling them, asking them about their use of PFAS and requesting the stop of the use of this chemical. And also signing those petitions and connecting with your members of parliament to share your concerns about water contaminants. So please take action and share this with others. I saw someone mention in the chat, educating others is a way to take action. Definitely, you are now informed and you can go out to the world and inform others too. I'll be sending out a survey after today's session, and I'd love it if you can please answer that. That'll be really helpful for us. We have our funding from Environment and Climate Change Canada, and we'd really like to report to them, tell them about the impact that our webinars have had. So remember that we have our next webinar all about plastics coming up on May 27th. Check that out on the Eventbrite link. We have a great lineup of speakers again. Karen Story from Metro Vancouver, who's going to be talking about bioplastics. Macarena Cataldo Hernandez from Veridis Research, who's doing research on removing microplastics from the environment. And Alison Carr from NADA, Package Free Grocer, to talk about the circular economy. And C-Smart is a charity in Vancouver, and we're able to have a really big reach, great impact to educate kids thanks to the support of people like you. So ways that you can support C-Smart is to follow us on social media, promote the things we're doing, share our next webinar with your friends and family, sign up for our newsletter so you can stay posted on all the wonderful work that we're doing. And if you like what we're doing, please consider becoming a monthly donor so we can continue inspiring the next generation of ocean heroes and helping educate people on contaminants. So thank you, everyone. I'd like to also acknowledge NADA is our promotional partner. But before you all head out, we have our Q&A session. So Muhannad, the first question we had is, how can the public spot PFAS packaging? And are the liners in disposable coffee cups PFAS?
Very good questions. Okay, I'll start with the easier one. Are the liners in coffee cups PFAS treated? Not as far as I know. I have not seen sort of lab testing or data to suggest that. It's a plastic liner. And that's what makes coffee cups so difficult to recycle. That's because it's mixed paper and plastic. And the second part of the question was, how can you spot it? That's a very tough one. It's the good news about PFAS or about food packaging is many of the food packaging out there, the food wrappers, the salad bowls, are not treated with PFAS. So this is a kind of a situation where there are safer alternatives out there, and it's easy for companies to move away from it. It's easy for governments to regulate it because the safer alternatives exist that don't contain PFAS, but it is hard for the consumer to spot it. So the best way to do that is to ask questions of your favorite takeout place, or your grocery store. If you go to the Loblaw or something and pick up some bread from the bakery, you can ask that question or send an email to them.
Thank you, Muhannad. And we have Aliana. Did you want to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Yeah. So I was wondering, so for the PFAS I was wondering when they end up in the landfill and part of that, like, I'm not sure if it does or not, but if they get burned, how does that like affect the PFAS?
So any of the presenters, the panelists can now unmute themselves as you please to answer.
I don't know the answer to this, but I could tell you that the burning will not break apart the PFAS. They will stay together. So then if it's being burned, it's either going up into the atmosphere or it's going into the ash. It's still going somewhere. I don't actually know. I think it takes really high temperature, extremely high temperature and pressure to break apart PFAS. Lorrie, perhaps you know? How do you actually get rid of PFAS?
Yeah, I'm not an expert either, but I do know
Yeah.
that incineration is an option, I think, in some cases.
But it's not just regular fire. It's like super high pressure, super high temperature. Like it's the carbon fluoride bond is one of the strongest bonds. It is the strongest bond in chemistry. So to try to break that apart requires a lot of energy. So if it's incinerated, it's still in the environment somewhere.
Great answers, thank you. Really interesting to find out about the carbon fluoride bond. I think that's going to be really great for me to include in our courses for students about these topics, because then we can link it to chemistry that way. Thank you. We have another question in the chat from Raymond. If PFAS is used in food packaging and also found to impact health and immunity, why aren't we removing PFAS faster than we currently are?
I'm not sure if you want me to take that question. We can try. So we have published the notice of intent indicating that we're just, looking at PFAS as a class. It is a process. The chemicals management plan is a science-based process where we do publish usually risk assessments and then risk management instruments, and there's often periods for consultation in those processes. So while it can take some time, it's there to make sure that the process is done thoughtfully and with due concern given to all the necessary sort of socioeconomic and other considerations in the process.
Maybe if I can jump in and just add, the other reason, as I said, is because our laws that govern chemicals aren't strong enough to deal with these emerging problems. A lot of them are really outdated, like the Environmental Protection Act. It's from 1999, and PFAS today is a 2021 problem. So we need stronger legislation. And we also, I also want to highlight one thing, which is the chemical industry lobbies the government a lot. And this is, not just with the chemical industry, with any other industry. And that's why people power is so important, because you need to counter the, lobbying of industry, because industry wants to keep their products on the market. So that's something that also people need to keep in mind about why things can be slow.
Yeah, thank you for your answers there. We have a question from Julius, who knows that some bacteria, such as Acidium microbium, has been found to biologically decompose some PFAS compounds. So do you know if there are any endeavors to apply microbial decomposition to this persistent problem?
I haven't heard of that. That's awesome, Julius. I will look that up. Maybe you should tell us more about it. I'd love to learn more about that. That's really cool.
Well, this wasn't my area of expertise. I have a microbiology background, and I did study microbial metabolism of certain heavy metal toxic compounds containing toxic compounds. But bioremediation is something that has been looked at for a variety of these kinds of complex carbon compounds as well, including things like nylon and various other very persistent kinds of recalcitrant chemicals. And It's one thing though to find the information, or to research it and find these results, but it's another for governments and such to then implement it. And I know that there has been some recent problems in entire environmental microbiology and bioremediation departments being canceled in some universities due to funding problems. So this is something that is we need to invest more in probably, but I don't know what there is out there in terms of actual applications nowadays of this. And it's been a while since I've even done my research on the metal metabolism and so on, but something to think about. I mean, I wouldn't recommend that be the main way to get rid of it, because that would not inspire a decrease in the usage and production of these compounds, because that's ultimately the best ways to just remove it from production. But since they're so persistent, it would be nice to have a way to additionally remove some of these from the environment.
Great suggestion, Julius. Thank you for sharing. We have two other questions. One from Eliana asking, how useful are petitions in actually influencing policy, or even things like calling your members of parliament? Are we impactful when we do that kind of work?
I can take that, and people can jump in. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts, especially from government, because you receive those petitions a lot. So petitions work, but there's also, as I think everyone knows, there's so many petitions out there all the time. Each person in government probably gets, not each person, but each person who's in charge of a certain issue in government gets so many petitions on so many different issues. And that's why being part of a really well thought out and designed campaign where there's, not just a petition that's just gonna be mailed to somebody and that's it. There's actually a strategy where, you're getting people to support a petition, then, people are setting up meetings with their MPs, talking to them about the issue. There are follow-up events to, keep mobilizing people. And this is why campaigning organizations are so important, because they coordinate all of that and help make petitions more effective. So I would say, sign petitions, that's great, but also consider looking at, groups that are really effective at what they do and follow them, because your voice will be heard in a more impactful way if you're doing it with an organization that's good at what it does.
Anyone from the government side wanted to chime in, or just an agreement? Are petitions useful, helpful?
I think public involvement is really important in all the stages. And so, yeah, I definitely encourage people to get involved. Often we have comment periods on documents and things. So if you can share your views during those, that's great too. Yeah, one thing that I think in my 20 years has, greatly improved is the ability for people to engage in these things. Back when I started, we would send out envelopes in snail mail, and now people can be reacting and sharing information instantly. So definitely take advantage of those opportunities and use those, because yeah, I think it's a great opportunity for people to get involved.
I appreciate that. Happy to know that it's going somewhere. Yeah, Angeline?
Yeah, I also wanted to add, as government employees, we swear an oath to support the government in power. And so literally when the public elect a government, we as public service employees, we support that government that's been democratically elected. So we take our marching orders from them. So the more the campaigns and the petitions, inform and motivate politicians to make changes, then they allow us to make those changes. But we are responsible to the democratically elected government. So it's really the politicians, in my opinion, that it's great to focus and get their attention to get these things changed.
Yeah, and just to agree with that, it's absolutely true. You want to focus on a politician and not blame the civil servant, because it's, the levels of power are a bit different. So talking to your MP can be really, really important.
We have a question from Lucas, but I'm going to quickly go to Julius's since it's relevant to the conversation we're having. Are physical snail mail letters like written by kids with artwork, are those just as effective at influencing policymakers, or is it more of a fluff piece?
I can try to answer that. From my experience, they would all be given equal weight. I mean, I might appreciate some artwork from a child to see that, because I love seeing the enthusiasm. But to me, yeah, I think it would have equal weight as something sent via email or electronic means. Right now, snail mail is a bit of a challenge with COVID too.
If I can just add like one general tip, just think about it this way. If you want your MP to remember the issue that you brought forward to them and remember the meeting that you had with them, the more creative that you can make your presentation of whatever you're asking, the more likely that they will remember it and speak about it to their colleagues, to whoever it is that they will speak to. So being creative in whatever way you think can help is always a good idea.
Wonderful recommendations. We're going to take one last question for the evening by Lucas here, asking about the 6 ppd quinone that we learned about earlier and the impact on salmon in Washington state. So the paper that was cited was quite new from 2021. So are you aware of what action is actually being taken now to limit the release of this chemical into these streams? Are tire manufacturers using alternate chemicals now that we know about this?
I would just have to say that the science is very new. Like, it was literally just published like in January. And also from like the BC Ministry of Environment perspective, we don't have jurisdiction over the chemicals. So it would be, I think it would be a federal initiative that would have to do that. So I'm not sure if Lorrie has a comment on that.
I can jump in on this one. Because of its impact on salmon, it's definitely been flagged for our contaminants technical working group and for our work on whales. So but as Angeline mentioned, the science is very, very new on this, but it's nice that it's been brought onto everyone's radar right now, because we are trying to kind of coordinate and figure out who's doing what and who can kind of contribute to the work on this, at least within our department. So that's kind of where we are at right now, which is really the beginning stages. I'll also mention that our colleague at Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Dr. Tanya Brown, she's starting a pilot study to look at these contaminants, at this contaminant, 6 ppd quinone, in salmon and their habitat. So it's kind of pushed us into working on this particular compound a bit further, but it's still quite early to be thinking about where it's headed.
Oh, well, it's really great to learn about this really new emerging research. So thank you so much for sharing that earlier this evening. So that concludes our session for tonight. Please, let's give a big round of applause to our guest speakers for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us for this Forever Chemicals webinar. I'm so appreciative. I feel like I personally learned a lot, and I promise this is going somewhere. I'm going to take this information and I'm going to distill it for our programs so that we can continue spreading the word about this. So what you crafted tonight is going to be really useful, and I very much appreciate it. To all of our participants this evening, thank you so much for joining us. It was lovely to get to be part of the session with all of you. I hope you enjoyed learning from our guest speakers, enjoyed the session in the breakout rooms, and I hope we can see you for our next webinar. And remember, if you can please fill out the survey. I just added the link. If you want to just do it right now, that's going to be really helpful for us. But I'll also be sending out an email afterwards with the recording from this evening, some of the links that people talked about and shared in the chat, and a bit of a summary of what we discussed this evening. So thank you again, everyone, for being part of this, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the evening.